now I have clay that looks like this, and it's easy enough to kind of just drape it over the sculpture like this, just to get started, because you really want to mass it all in. Here's another sheet of clay, and just put it. It's really important in the beginning to make sure, because this is terracotta and we're going to fire it, that you push it down quite a bit with your hands. Some people take pieces of wood and things like that, and because that helps you like push it down and tap it. Here's another one. So I kind of go back and forth. I put one in the back. Now I'm going to put one in the front like this, and another one. I'm going to put it in the back here and start building out the neck. And here I have my sheet. I'm going to wrap it around and make sure that all the air bubbles, there's no air pockets inside the clay. Almost in the way, what you want in the beginning is your armature to be covered very much like what a bowling ball kind of looks like. Just a little bit of clay throughout before you start taking measurements. You don't want to do it too early. And this is a really good tool. You can just get it from Home Depot. And the reason you should use it is to keep everything nice and flat, so you see the planes of the head. You use a little bit more strength to push it down and remove any of the air bubbles that could potentially be in your sculpture. One thing that happens is that, so we have the wire armature here. One thing to keep in mind, and I'm going to point this out quite a bit because it's going to happen, is the clay is wanting to like move down. So if you don't compensate by adding a little bit more clay to the top, you're going to see it's going to be hitting. It's going to be like coming up. Right now it doesn't look like a head. So we're going to be doing a head shape next, because we got to, in sculpture, you got to start out with that structure. If the structure is not there, then you're going to have a terrible sculpture. Make sure you push the sculpture in, the clay, and just kind of push it up, because we don't want this thing to be dripping down, and it will. It's going to be like dripping down all the time. You constantly be pushing it up just slightly. This top part is a little bit tough because I don't want to put too much clay, but I also know that this is going to drip down just because of gravity. So when you're looking at the skull, this is way off. If you look at it, you can see that up on the top it's higher, but you actually want this back part to be slightly higher. So I do have to go up a little bit. One of the things I try and do is to let this sit for just a little bit of time and harden, like just by not covering it. That way, this underlying armature that's made out of clay will harden a little bit over time, and then I can add more clay and it's not going to be dripping. So let's wait a couple of minutes with this, and we're just going to let it dry, and then we're going to come back to it and we're going to add more clay. You can see the head is coming along, but I would still consider this to be very much an armature for the sculpture. The head is about maybe an inch or two on each side, but we have to add the skull, and I like to do it very slowly in the beginning. So the widest part of the skull is this area right here. So I want to add a little bit more clay towards the back. And also, don't keep in mind that this is a lot of weight, so you want to make sure you balance it out by adding clay in the neck and on the back. Some of the best portrait sculptures I've seen were the 19th century sculptors, and I really love the sculptures of Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux. A lot of the French were really good. Nowadays, in contemporary art, you don't see a lot of French artists, which is very odd because they used to be extremely popular. But nowadays, there's a lot of Italians still in the game, a lot of Brazilians, and the Brazilians are extremely good. And of course, a lot of Americans are also extremely good. There's a lot of great artists in this area where I live, which is the DC metro area. And there is a lot of money to be made in sculpture from this area because people do make quite a bit of money. One of the things that a lot of people do is, like, you want to get into the details of the skull right off the bat, but that's usually a bad idea without having the shape of the skull done fairly well. You don't have to sculpt the skull. It's really just the shape of it that you need to worry about. You might have a reference up for yourself of the shape of the skull so you can refer to it. So the widest point of the skull is going to be right about here. Right about here is going to be your widest point. And there's usually a line just above the eyes that is the widest point, and it tapers down to the face. Usually wait until I finish the face to add any detail of the hair. The hair is almost like clothes. Feels like almost like a drapery, but a lot of people mess it up. It is very difficult doing hair, I believe. Let's add a little bit more to the occipital bone right here. This is when calipers will come in handy because you'll get the proportions a whole lot better if you use a caliper. As I'm scraping down, I'm actually hitting the armature. So that should be your clue to add a little bit more clay on here. And let's start adding clay. We might have to remove a little bit of this chin part, but that's the best part about the paper. You can kind of just push it in. You can see I'm getting rid of a lot of the necks just by doing this because it's pushing in the paper, and the paper is going to get all wet underneath here. Let's add a little bit to the front here. We need quite a bit of clay here to support the weight of the clay kind of coming down. Just have to make sure that the proportions are relatively correct for the skull. I'm still going to work on the skull shape of the head, but I want to make sure that all of these lumps of clay I've been adding are pretty much smooth. Make sure that there's no air pockets. That's pretty important, especially in the beginning. I'm going to finish adding a little bit of this clay. So this is at the point that I would consider this to be a good support for building your sculpture. So the next steps are going to be adding the anatomy, working on the skull, adding the important landmarks in the skull like the zygomatic arch, figuring out the proportions of the head, where the chin is exactly the width of the skull. And of course, we'll add a little bit more to the torso. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.